All right, I think we should probably go ahead and get started. So just going to go through a few housekeeping items first before we begin. Thank you for all of you kind of coming into this meeting with your mic off. That's going to help a lot. There will be a question and answer portion of this evening, and that'll be towards the last 30 minutes or so. So if you have a question during the presentation that you don't want to forget, just go ahead and pop it in the chat. And then when we get to that part, I will stop the recording at that time, and then we can go through those with Lynn. If you want to see just the presenter, so Lynn, you're going to want to scroll over her picture, and there's a pin button. It looks like a thumbtack. So you're going to want to click on that, and then she'll be the one that you see. You won't be seeing everyone else here. Again, Lynn was gracious enough to allow us to have this meeting be recorded for those of you for people who couldn't come, and if you want to go back and reference this at a later date. It'll be on our website hopefully tomorrow, and it'll be there for 2 weeks. So thank you, Lynn, for allowing us to do that. So let me very briefly introduce Lynn. She's our New Hampshire's very own expert in the area of supporting families, and educators support children through anxiety and worry. Since last spring, you've probably seen her on WMUR quite a bit, really talking about how we can support our kids and our families, our neighbors during this pandemic. And certainly now more than ever, we need some support in managing kind of the challenges of daily life that we're all experiencing. So I'm hopeful that each one of us will be able to take something away from tonight, whether it's to support our children, our own children, our students, ourselves, and certainly one another. So please allow me to welcome Lynn. Oh, you're muted.
I know, Field, you're muted. Yeah. Hi, everyone. I'm seeing some familiar names pop up. So hi, people that I know you know me. Thanks for spending some time with me. Yes, Marcy, it's true. I was at WMUR. It got to the point where my mom was getting annoyed with the things that I was saying. So at first she was sort of like, oh, your dad and I watched you on MUR. And then it was sort of like, why did you say that again? So they're very nice. Charisse Leclerc is the anchor that calls me, and they'll send me a message at like 4 o'clock in the afternoon and say like, can we just talk to you for a few minutes? And really the biggest deal about that is whether or not I have makeup on, because I'm not going on that camera unless I got makeup on. So so thanks everybody for coming. I am gonna show a PowerPoint as I do this, just to sort of give you some things to look at. And my goal tonight was to really give you as many concrete things as possible. things that you can do with your kids, things that you can do in the classroom, things that you can do for yourself, because I know that we're all sort of feeling a little like, really, we're still in this? We didn't really predict that it was going to last for this long. I will tell you, however, I happened to be on a panel discussion with a physician. I was doing it I was here, obviously, but it was through Rhode Island. And this guy is one of the chief public health people out of Brown University. His name is Dr. Hashish Aj, is how you say, Jha. J-H-A, Hashish J-H-A. And I didn't know this, but apparently he's been on national news a lot talking about all this kind of stuff. I was supposed to be talking about anxiety and mental health and COVID, and he was supposed to be answering questions about COVID and the vaccine. I was hanging on this guy's every word. He was so helpful. He was so optimistic. He really feels like once we get the vaccination program going, which I think it is in the process of getting going, that the summer is really going to feel almost normal, and that school is going to look like school. He said we're not going to be back to 2019 by the time school starts next fall. He said, but it's going to feel really close. So I have been saying all along, people have been saying to me, well, should we talk about, that things are going to get back to normal? And people will say, I don't want to get my kids' hopes up. And my whole thing is, yes, you do, right? Hopes are supposed to be up. That's where we want hopes. And also, that's all we got, right, at this point. So at least, we can see the light at the end of the tunnel. But it is really okay to talk to ourselves and to talk to our kids about the fact that this is not going to last forever, that everybody who's the expert on this feels like by the summer, things are really going to feel better again. So it's okay to talk about that. And you should talk about that, and you should remind yourself of that. This pandemic has gone sort of in phases, as we all know. And at the beginning, it was just a lot of fear and chaos and confusion and getting through the day and not knowing how long it was going to last, and some misplaced optimism that we would be closed for 2 weeks and that everything would be fine. Then we moved through the summer. I think the summer in New Hampshire is a beautiful place to be. Everybody was coming here, right? We were like, go away, go away. And that felt okay. Then we started school. That was a little bit of a slap in the face, wasn't it? That here we are doing this again. But I think that schools and educators and administrators, although I would not want to be an administrator for any amount of money, did a good job, had more warning, of course, planning what we could do with kids. What were the ways that we could better connect with them remotely? I don't think that anybody predicted how up and down it was going to be, how in and out and switching around it was going to be. I think there was a few critical times in this, and I've paid attention to them. One of them was Halloween. So if you don't remember Halloween, which was 87 months ago, that was the first big holiday that we experienced, where we realized we weren't going to be able to do with our kids what we wanted to do with our kids and our family members. And it also, unfortunately, was the day that we turned the clocks back. So that darkness and that really real warning that we were headed into a New Hampshire winter, I think really sort of knocked a bit of the stuffing out of us. Going through the holidays and Thanksgiving and Christmas, I have to give, great kudos to all of us, because I think we really, as far as me talking to families and people figuring things out, I think we did okay. I think the other really tough time was January 4th. That was Monday. That was after Christmas break. And this is where I really began to hear a lot from parents and from kids that they just didn't feel like they could pull themselves up again and sit in front of those computers for more remote learning again. There was also, as you may have noticed, a lot going on in the country, and there was this sort of collective building of stress and holding breath and tight muscles. And I feel like it just was exhausting for all of us. And that's kind of where we are now. I mean, certainly things have calmed down a little bit in terms of everybody's, like we're not in imminent doom, I don't think. And I think the vaccine and getting that out is making people feel a little bit better about it. But we've got some tough months to go through, and we still got some darkness, and we still got some cold. I'll say also, here was a bad day for me. When all that snow melted, right? I was really enjoying the snow. That was a kicker. I don't think we deserve that at all. I don't think we deserve to have 30 inches of beautiful snow and have it disappear. So that was just nature screwing with us a little bit. So here we are. We've got to get through the spring. We'll get there, right? Where light is coming. In the meantime, I want to go through the things that I have been talking about with the families that I see. Obviously, as you can imagine, I've been on these kinds of meetings since March 15th. That's really all I've been doing. A few in-person gigs, actually, but this is what I've been doing. So I've had a lot of time to think about it and had a lot of time to put my thoughts together because I think about it and talk about it all the time. So I'm gonna pull up a PowerPoint now here, and I am not a Google Meet person. I am a Zoom webinar person, but I've been getting better. So bear with me. I think I can do it. I'm gonna go like this, and then I'm gonna go like this. And I'm guessing you can see me. If you can't see me, let me know, but I'm guessing you can see me. So let's talk about where we are. One of the things that's really important as we go through this is that this is an opportunity not to be missed. And I don't mean opportunity in the silver lining opportunity. I mean, there are some things that have been illuminated, some things that have been exposed, some things that we can feel good about as we've gone through this. And I don't want us to lose track of those things. One of the key things to remember, and of course I'm going to talk a lot about the mental health of our kids and the mental health of ourselves as well, but one of the key things to remember is that we weren't doing very well prior to 2020 in terms of anxiety and depression with our kids. It wasn't like everything was going swimmingly and then the pandemic hit and the floor fell out. Things were not good. The numbers were increasing. There was great concern about increasing numbers of anxious kids, of depressed teens, children experiencing depression and unfortunately suicide at younger and younger ages, and the adults also not feeling so great. So what have we learned through this, and what do we want to pay attention to? Because there's been, from my perspective, a lot of interesting things. There was one article that came out pretty early on in the pandemic, probably like at the beginning of the summer. And what it said was that don't expect or don't anticipate a huge tidal wave of new mental health issues with our kids. What we should anticipate is an exacerbation of existing problems. And I think that's probably true. The way that I've been talking about it is the cracks became chasms. The other thing that this article said, which was talking my language, is that for the adults dealing with kids, it was really the anticipation of what was going to happen that was more distressing than what was actually happening. This is how anxiety works. This is how worry works. You go into that worst case scenario, you think about it. There was certainly a lot of material to work with during the beginning of the pandemic and throughout the fall as we were getting back to school. So we really want to pay attention to all of this anticipatory anxiety. I think maybe that has topped off a little bit because I think we're kind of getting the hang of being in a pandemic, but pay attention to sort of that pattern of worry. What we want to really think about as we're moving out of this and as we're moving into more normal times is, were there patterns that were established during the pandemic that we want to make sure that don't become chronic? So the difficult thing with anxiety is that anxiety is all about avoidance. Anxiety is all about getting rid of stuff. Anxiety is all about no thank you. And one of the drums that I beat on a regular basis, and long before all of this, is the fact that we live in an elimination culture. one of the things that anxiety wants is for us to get rid of stuff, get rid of uncomfortable situations, get rid of uncertainty, get rid of feelings. We're a culture that likes to make things go away. We're a culture that likes to fix things and say we're moving on. The problem with anxiety is that the more you try and get rid of it, the stronger it gets. The more that you say, don't think about that, or don't worry about that, or don't get anxious about that, the stronger it gets. What's been interesting during this is that we haven't been able to get rid of this. If you have not worried through this, I don't know what you're doing. I don't know what you're taking, right? But kudos to you. Worrying is a normal part of being in this kind of a situation. And what we've had to realize is that it's really about tolerating the uncertainty rather than being on a quest to get rid of it. Because as a country, as a world, as a state, we haven't been able to get rid of worry. Now, do we wish we could? Yes. Is this kind of an interesting experience for us to have in a larger community? Yeah, because we've had to tolerate the very things that anxiety doesn't like. Anxiety demands certainty and comfort. That's what it wants. It wants to know exactly what's going to happen, wants to know exactly what the plan is, and it wants to feel comfortable as we're moving forward. There is no way that during the last several months we have had too much certainty, and we certainly haven't had a whole lot of comfort in the big picture. We've had to deal with uncertainty. And what that has really allowed for us to hopefully demonstrate to our children is the ability to adapt, the ability to manage when things don't go as planned. One of the first things that I was talking about in the spring, because I was talking to a whole bunch of high schools and high school students, was how fear of missing out became missing out, right? When FOMO became Mo. And that kids really had to tolerate not having graduation, not being able to have the end of school activities that they depended upon, not being able to have the senior spring that all those seniors were looking for. Here we are going to go through this again for the second time. So now we've had a little practice, unfortunately. Being able to talk about the toleration of uncertainty. How do we manage when we don't know exactly what's going to happen? And the dynamic that happens oftentimes in anxious families is that you try and give as much information as you can and get ahead of any uncertainty. And I'm a big fan of being able to say to kids, we just don't know. We're not sure. And we've certainly had to do that during all of this. So if we look pre-pandemic, if we look at our culture or our schools or our parenting and the desire to get rid of uncertainty, it has set our kids up. It really has. The ability to not know exactly what's going to happen and to begin to think about the language that is really more important for our kids to be able to be conversant in. Right? It's not like we want our kids to be uncomfortable and uncertain. It's just inevitable that they're going to have those experiences. So in order to grow, in order to take on new territory, in order to move into the world, we have to be able to step into these things. Think about these kids that have gone through this. And I've talked to a lot of kids about this. I was talking to a high school senior about this the other day. I said, think about, there's somebody someday is going to take an AP history class in 2020. They're going to be talking about it. And she said, well, we've been joking about that. That we won't be able to do it in 1 year because there's so much that happened. And I said to her, think about all of the things that you've handled. Think about you as you move through life now, how you have such a greater tolerance for not knowing, and maybe an increased confidence in yourself and how to get through things when we really don't know how they're going to go. This is the language that we want to use as we talk about kids, particularly as we're coming out of this. The other drum that I have been banging for years, and I'm going to continue to bang, is that we really need to think about prevention. Now, the pandemic has gotten in the way a little bit of me talking so much about prevention because we're in the middle of this thing. And so it's really been acute in terms of handling all these different situations. But the thing about anxiety treatment and anxiety prevention, and the same can be said for depression treatment and depression prevention, is that they require the same skills. And so whether or not you're listening to this thinking, okay, so my kid has been super anxious about this, or I'm really worried about what's going to happen when we go back to school in the fall, or I've been really anxious about this, or our family has been really struggling to try and figure all this stuff out. Whether or not you're thinking that, or you're thinking, okay, so my kids are doing okay. They're not all that anxious, but I just want to stay ahead of this thing. The skills that I'm about to talk about fit both of those categories, prevention and treatment. What we want to pay attention to is how do we equip our kids with the emotional skills that they need in order to move forward in life. So I talk a lot about emotional management. Some people use the term emotional regulation. There's a guy, as I'm talking, I'm just going to throw you out all these recommendations of things that I've read and all the podcasts that I've listened to in the last 12 months that have been helpful to me. One of them is, there's a guy named Mark Brackett, Brackett. He wrote a book called Permission to Feel. That book talks about, he uses the term emotional regulation. It talks about emotional literacy, the skill that kids need to be able to put words to their feelings, to be able to articulate them, to be able to communicate and then to regulate their emotions. Kids with greater levels of emotional literacy, we know, and the earlier we start, the better, but of course it's never too late. Those kids have better mental health outcomes than kids that have low emotional literacy. So I recommend, so anyway, he wrote a book called Permission to Feel. If you don't want to read the book, he was also on Brene Brown's podcast. Brene Brown has a podcast called Unlocking Us, and he was a guest on that. I highly recommend listening to that episode. You don't have to listen to all of Brene's episode, although the one with Dolly Parton was also pretty awesome. But listen to the one with Mark Brackett. Talking about emotional management. And when I'm talking about emotional management, I'm not talking about getting rid of emotions. Remember, we've got this elimination culture, right? Suppress, get rid of, self-medicate, all that kind of stuff. I'm talking about being able to recognize them and feel them and even acknowledge the inevitability of them showing up. And then the next step is, how do you respond to them? So I am showing you a slide now, which is probably, in a nutshell, the most important slide that I show, probably. Step one, we're going to have thoughts and feelings and sensations. Step two, how do we learn to respond and react differently? Giving kids that ability, modeling that for them, showing them how to do that is really preventative. Because what I'm seeing now, and I'm seeing this particularly with tweens and teens, is that they are not so great at both identifying what they're feeling. They can identify it, but generally not so accurately, actually, and not being able to manage or normalize those feelings. There are a lot of kids who are just really anxious about feeling anxious, that they don't have a sense that their moods change. They get very panicky when they don't feel right, both physically and emotionally. So really being able to normalize that for kids and talk about it. When I am talking about emotional reactivity, you all know what that means, right? The difference between somebody who, you cut them off, somebody cuts you off at traffic and you go like, hey, right? Or somebody gets cut off in traffic and they get out of their car with a baseball bat and they smash the windshield, right? Big, huge emotional reactions, explosions. Emotional reactivity actually is one of the things that we look at that predicts failure in family therapy. So if you are working on a problem, if there's a goal with a family and they're working on it, one of the main things that gets in the way, there are a few things, but one of the main things that gets in the way is a pattern of emotional reactivity. This idea that I should just explode and get it over with and then, oh gosh, I feel so much better. Or I've just got to get my emotions out. Now you can get them out, but there are different ways of getting them out. And emotional reactivity, although it feels good to the person who got it out, causes collateral damage in family members and gets in the way of problem solving. So here's my first exercise, and I'm going to give you a bunch of these things. These are homework assignments that I give with families that I work with, and these are the things that I talk about a lot. If you are talking to kids about the difference between emotional management and emotional reactivity, it is fun to come up with a list of jobs where emotional reactivity just doesn't really work out that well. And the thing that makes it kind of fun and kind of silly is that this applies to really most jobs. So you really don't want an emotionally reactive dental hygienist. You don't even really want an emotional reactive hairstylist. You certainly don't want an emotionally reactive kindergarten teacher or an emotionally reactive plumber, right? And when you start to talk to kids about how important it is in so many things that they're going to do in their lives to be able to manage their emotions, this is a way to have that discussion with them. And then I also talked about emotional literacy. For those of you who have younger kids, and even if you have older kids, there are some really easy to find, and probably most teachers that work in elementary school have these, but they're really easy to find things you can print out that list a whole bunch of different emotions. So instead, Mark Brackett talks about the big three: sad, mad, glad, and giving kids this vocabulary. So if you have a child that you feel like has a hard time sort of putting words to what they're feeling, give them a cheat sheet. And it's really okay to say to kids, not this is what you're feeling, but I wonder if you might be feeling this. Or it sounds like, based on what you're saying, it sounds like maybe you're feeling this, and that's a normal way to feel. Get them conversant in talking about this. Now, do not mistake this for me saying that you should have deep, meaningful conversations about feelings all the time. This is what makes therapists annoying. This is what my kids tell me not to do. And I don't think I do it with my kids, actually. But it's really about just sort of dropping those crumbs, making it a normal part of your conversation, asking them, oh, it sounds like you feel this, or how did you feel when that happened? Because the more that you make it normal, the more that you make it a part of their ordinary life and how they're getting through the day, the less they're going to push back against it. If you're always coming in, right, and we're going to have this really deep conversation and we're going to talk about your feelings, they're going to start to resist that. Some of you may have been raised by people like that, and, quite frankly, it's annoying. All right, so let's talk about 4 of the key patterns that I think are super important if we're talking about anxiety and prevention, depression prevention. And really, there are a bunch of patterns that I talk about. These are the 4 that are really so important in the context of the pandemic. So these are the ones that I'm going to go over right now. This is the negative. And then there's a positive. So rigid, the corollary to that is flexibility, global its parts, permanent it's temporary, and internal is obviously external. So let me go through these with you. Oh, look, I forgot I put that slide there. All right, so flexibility versus rigidity. So and I talked about this at the beginning, that the ability to adapt, the ability for you and your kids to be flexible as you go through this we've had a lot of practice with it. When I am talking about being rigid versus being flexible, people who are rigid give themselves about this much room to live their lives. So people who are rigid, we might see that in perfectionism, right? And it's funny, I travel around and all over the place, but not obviously in the last few months, but schools and districts they'll send me a little note ahead of time wanting me to know about their district, right? I know about your district because I live like 5 miles from you guys. So I know that achievement, and I know that performance, and I know that doing well, and I know that perfectionism is sort of, swimming around there in Bo. I know that. When we are rigid in this way, it makes you hard to get along with. It makes it hard for you to manage your life. The more that we pull it in, the tighter you get, the more restrictive things feel for you. So When I am talking about flexibility, I am talking about widening this out. And one of the things that happens sometimes when I'm talking to people who tend to be pretty rigid or tend to be pretty, perfectionistic, they want to go all or nothing on me. They're like, oh, okay, so we're just going to get rid of all the rules. You just want my family to be chaos, right? My kids can do whatever they want. No, it's about going out. Flexibility exists outside of the important boundaries and structures and rules and time management and planning and preparing that we need to do. That's where flexibility lives. So being well prepared and helping your kids learn how to manage their time, and you thinking about what are the important restrictions and boundaries that you have in your family, we're not going to get rid of those things. But flexibility means, how do you manage when things don't go the way that you expect? How do you handle life when it throws you a curveball? Which we have had plenty of practice dealing with that. One of the things that was interesting at the beginning of the pandemic, y'all remember the beginning of the pandemic, is that we were all sort of like, deers in the headlight, and people were saying, do whatever you need to do, right? So it doesn't matter, like, just, if your kids are on screens all the time, don't worry about it. And if you have your daytime pajamas and then you change into your nighttime pajamas, that's okay. And if kids are eating Cheez-Its for breakfast and Fruit Loops for lunch, who cares, right? And we were all just sort of like, oh, okay, we just have to get through this and it'll be over. Once it became clear that this was not going to be over in a few weeks, you started hearing again from people, all right, the wild west of the pandemic now needs to come to a close, and we need to put structure back in. We need to start paying attention. And one of the things that I wonder if you guys discovered, because I certainly discovered, is that when I abandoned the things that made my life feel routine and structured, I felt worse. When I stayed in my pajamas till 3 p.m, that did not feel like a treat anymore. It felt like a punishment. So being able to pay attention to what are the structures, what are the routines, what are the important boundaries that you want to have in place, but when can you be flexible? When is it? And did you notice, if you were incredibly rigid, how hard this was? And have you noticed in your kids that for those kids that were very rigid and very perfectionistic, this has been hard for them? One of the things that I have heard over and over and over again is that one of the reasons that remote learning is hard is because high-achieving perfectionistic kids don't have unlimited access to teachers the way that they are used to. So parents were filling in that role. I had one family where they were sort of gone for a while, and then they came back, and they actually didn't even live in this state, but I was meeting with them remotely. And the mom was saying, I thought she was doing okay with her perfectionism until I was the teacher. So recognizing, where is it that we can allow that flexibility? And if you are really rigid, or if someone in your family is really rigid, you're hard to get along with. That's just a fact. So, all right, I'm going to come back onto the screen here. All right, look at me. I got it. All right. And remember, anxiety is the epitome of rigidity, right? It wants to know exactly how things are going to go, wants everything to go as planned. Families always say to me, when worry shows up, where it really explodes is when we have a plan and then we have to deviate from the plan. One of the things that you can talk to your kids about, you can ask your kids about, is where do you think that we were most flexible in this? And were there things about figuring out how to manage the pandemic that were actually kind of surprising to you? The other really good question to ask your kids, are there places where we were more flexible that you feel really benefited you? And they may say, yeah, I didn't have a bedtime and that was awesome. But, just disregard that from your 8th grader. But are there things about our schedule, about our life that you noticed? Many, many kids have said to me, I have enjoyed not being overscheduled. Many, many kids have said that. And parents have said that too. But kids are really noticing what it's like when they have a little bit more free time. I had one high schooler said to me, I didn't ever know what it was like to be bored. People would talk about being bored, and so I knew it was a thing, but I didn't really know what they were talking about. And she said, I've had the opportunity to be bored, and it's kind of cool. Like there are some afternoons or some days where I just have nothing to do. And she said that was a completely new experience for me. The skill building exercises, and you may be looking at this and saying, where can you cut corners? Here's a little tip for those of you who are dealing with very rigid perfectionists, either yourself or in your family. Perfectionism requires things be exact, and I'm always thinking about what the skill is that we want to teach a perfectionist. One of the things that happens in schools very, very often is that if we have a perfectionist who has trouble getting work in on time, and I'm talking about perfectionism, I'm not talking about kids that have other reasons they have trouble getting work in on time, but a perfectionist that doesn't hand in their homework because it's not perfect, or that's spending an enormous amount of time on homework, staying up later, doing more work for more hours than the teacher at all recommends. The skill that a perfectionist doesn't have is knowing when to cut corners. And what happens in schools is that we often put in accommodations that allow for extra time. Extra time as an accommodation is pretty common. And for many things, it is absolutely appropriate. It is not appropriate if you are dealing with a perfectionist, because you are actually helping the perfectionism get stronger. So being able to say to somebody who's, has to have things a certain way, or if your child can't hand in their homework or is having trouble finishing things on time, how do you coast? How do you cut corners? Perfectionism and success are not equivalent. Perfectionists have a hard time being successful often, except in very few places, because it's just not possible to do everything that you need to do. And you need to be able to tolerate handing something in and feeling uncomfortable with that. There was a woman that I listened to. It was a woman who did Dr. Death. If you haven't listened to that podcast, Dr. Death season 1, there's a Dr. Death season 2 also. Both of them are pretty great. But the woman who did Dr. Death season 1, she's a medical investigative reporter, put together this podcast. She said, I have never handed in something because it was done. I have always handed it in because it was due. So thinking about that, that's an issue of rigidity versus flexibility. And really thinking about the combination of flexibility with a routine, right? So your kids have a bedtime, but there are times when you extend the bedtime. There are certain rules that you have in the house, but there are certain times that you make exceptions for them based on certain things. That is flexibility combined with routine, and kids do really well with that versus the rigidity. So the next pattern that I want to talk about, and this is a critical pattern, because we know that a global cognitive style is a real predictor of depression and anxiety. So if you are global in your cognitive style, what that means when we're talking about it in terms of anxiety and depression is that you paint the world with a broad brush. So you use big words. Global thinkers use big words, like everything, nobody, always, I never get what I want, I always have a bad day, nothing ever goes my way. This is generally the language of overwhelmed. When you are hearing yourself talk this way, when you are feeling this way, when your kids are talking to you in this way, right? Nothing ever goes my way. That means that they're overwhelmed. Maybe they're overwhelmed with the anger that they're not getting what they want, but oftentimes it's because they've just got too much emotion and they don't really know what to do with it. People who are global in their thinking, right? If you think globally, right? Nothing ever goes my way. I'll never get what I want. They get to the place of why bother. Global thinkers get to the place of why bother. And that's a dangerous place for kids to get. We don't want kids to get to that place, because then they do give up and they do get passive. And then, what's the point? A kid said to me the other day, what's the point? Right? So listen for that language. The opposite, or the corollary to global language, is parts. So thinking about things broken down into parts. This is what educators do all the time. They take a huge chunk of information and they help you find the beginning and the middle of in the end. You're doing long division. We're going to help you go through the steps. You're learning how to get dressed because you're 4 years old. You're learning how to get dressed. So you learn the parts of the process. The other really good way to think about parts is the parts of you, and to be able to talk to your children about the parts of them. Right? So if you've heard me talk before, and I know many of you have, you know I like to pull out the anxiety and give it a name. I like to externalize it. I like to create that distance between you and your anxiety. Creating this distance and giving you the opportunity to observe your own patterns, observe your own thinking, observe the places that you're stuck. This is really helpful if we're dealing with anxiety, if we're dealing with depression, if we're dealing with trauma, if we're dealing with impulse problems, if we're dealing with addiction, right? Because it slows things down, and it also does something that's really important, both for adults, but especially for kids. It protects their dignity. And instead of labeling them as something global, right? You're lazy, or you're, somebody said to me the other day, I just have a difficult child. Well, no, you have a kid who's difficult at times. It may feel a little global right now because you've all been in the house for a long time together. But there are parts of this child that aren't difficult. So I talk about flow of steps and sequencing. And what I mean by that, those are two sort of, those are two exercises that I might give. Flow of steps is just basically breaking things down into steps and helping kids understand that you move through something piece by piece by piece. Sequencing, the same thing. There's a beginning, a middle, and an end. And so when your child is feeling overwhelmed, when you're hearing that language of, I'll never get this done, this will never be over, nobody listens to me, you want to say to them, let's break it down into parts. Let's think about this a little bit, right? We also want to look for exceptions to the global rules. So, when I say this all the time because it's true, it's a true story. When my kids were little and they would say, you never let us have any fun, I would say, I never let you have any fun. I never let you have any fun. And then I train them to say, in this moment right now, you are not letting us have fun, right? True statement. Right now, in this moment. So it's a way to help kids contain. It's a way to help them see different parts of situations. The global language alert is just a game that I play with families where I say, we're all going to listen for people being global, right? So you might hear somebody say like, oh, we'll never get out of this line at the grocery store, right? And they sort of elbow you and say, yeah, see, global. And having them become familiar with the difference between global language and parts language is enormously helpful. It's something that I talk to families about in treatment, but it is so helpful preventatively because it's the opposite of getting overwhelmed. Parts. How do we take this apart? How do we take this, a piece at a time, a part at a time? Just as I was talking to you at the beginning about this pandemic, right? It feels like this huge thing. There were definitely stages to it. There were definitely parts to it, and we've moved through these parts, and we're moving, I feel like, into a better part after we get through the next probably few months. All right, the next pattern that I really want you to pay attention to, and this is so important as you're talking to your kids, and it is really, really important as we're talking particularly to tweens and teens about their mental health, about their mental well-being, is permanent versus temporary. Permanent versus temporary is just as it sounds. It is the belief that things can change versus the belief that things are set in stone. And the way that this becomes so problematic is when kids believe that they are who they are and that change isn't possible. One of the things that drives me absolutely nuts about mental health, education, and awareness, and the way we're talking to kids about it, is that there is a lot of language that is based on a mental health diagnosis becoming an identity. Mental health awareness doesn't mean that it does mean it's a great thing because we're talking about these things and we're recognizing how common they are. If I could see you all, I would say how many people here have a family that's absolutely free of substance abuse, anxiety, and depression? Anybody got one of those families? I can't see you, but I know that none of you are raising your hands. It is incredibly common. So when we talk about it, when we bring it out into the open, when we hear athletes talking about it, when we hear celebrities talking about it, when they hear grandpa talking about it in a way that is educated and informed, we are telling kids that it's a common experience. But what we don't want to tell kids is that it is a chronic disease. That language that I have depression, this is who I am, I can't do this because I have anxiety, I will have depression for the rest of my life. Not only is that scientifically inaccurate, but it is incredibly harmful because it gets in the way of the very thing that we need in order to heal from things, which is something called positive expectancy. There is a ton of research on positive expectancy, and it is simply the belief that things will get better. And this is how people heal from surgery, from cancer. I just had a friend go through significant cancer treatment, and I could hear in her language, right? I'm going to get through this. I know that I'm going to find my way to the other side of this, which she just finished treatment, so she has. Positive expectancy, the belief that things can change. Pay attention to permanent language, and we also really want to make sure that we are letting kids know that they are changing all the time. As one of my teachers said, you couldn't stay the same even if you wanted to. We're changing all the time. There is actually a very great resource, and I'll put it in the chat when we get to there. There is an organization called, and it's sort of a mouthful of a name, a little pretentious actually, the National Institute for the Clinical Application of Behavioral Medicine, NICABM.com. They do great work. They do a lot of continuing education programs in my field. I've done a bunch of stuff with them. But if you go onto their website, and I'll put it in the chat, remind me somebody, NICABM.com, they have some great infographics that are there free that you can print out. If you have teenagers, or just even for yourself, if you are a teacher, there is one on neuroplasticity that I highly recommend that you take a look at. It's, a beautiful colored handout, but you can also they have a printing version too that you can just do it in black and white. This idea that just because you think it doesn't make it so, that moods change, that if you have had a rough time during this is not who you are. It doesn't define you. One of my worries is that a lot of kids are going to experience anxiety and depression during the pandemic, which would be totally appropriate, and that somebody is going to give them the message that they've caught this permanent thing. I am not making this up because they say this to me all the time, and they actually get pissed off at me when I contradict them. They have been told, they believe, and they absorb this idea that this is who they are, that they have something wrong in their brain, that it's genetic, that this is going to be with them forever and ever. There are certainly genetic components to it, but an enormous amount of the recovery from anxiety and depression is much more social than anything else in terms of, and that's why it's been so tough, because we've, particularly for kids, we've limited their social connection, which is why most kids are struggling right now. All right, so here are some skill building exercises, right? These are the assignments that I give, and this is just kind of a fun family discussion to have, right? What are 5 ways you've changed in the last several years? If you've got a little tiny person, right? If they're 5, say, what are some ways that you've changed in the last year? And you got to help them. They're not going to be able to do it. But if you've got a 15-year-old, what are some things that you used to really be into? What are some things that you used to love when you were 10 that now that you're 15, you're like, oh my God, please. Talk to them about how they're changing, how you're changing, how their thoughts change, how their moods change. The more malleable that they believe, because it's true, that their brains are, that their experiences are, that their moods are, the better they're going to be at being able to handle when things don't go the way that they want them to go. And it absolutely is necessary for them to continue to have hope and positive expectancy. If you are told that you will not change, why bother? That's what we have to pay attention to. So for older kids, and this is if anybody out there is an educator that works with, you know, 5th or 6th grade and up, it's interesting to think about the things historically and medically and scientifically that human beings used to believe that now we know are, you know, we would say like, oh my gosh, that's crazy. Right? George Washington died because they bled him too much. He actually died of blood loss. He was sick and they kept bleeding him like they used to do. And that's actually what killed him. A success journal is, and you can do this, you know, you can write this down. You can do it in a journal, but you can also just have conversations with your kids about helping them connect back to the things that they have succeeded at, the things that they've done well. When human beings are not feeling good emotionally, when you are anxious, when you are depressed, your memory is impacted. Anxious people get very amnesic to their successes. So you ask them to think about what happened in the past. What was it? Well, remember that good time we had, you know, or remember how you handled that well? They deny it. Depressed people also, when they think back and they're sort of scouring their memories or sort of taking a little walk down memory lane, depressed people pull up negative experiences much more than positive experiences. So we want to create that skill. It was interesting when I have a little nephew who's in 3rd grade and is cute as a button. And he was starting to go back into school, and he was doing remote learning. They live outside of Boston. And one of the assignments that he had was to think about a happy family memory that he could remember. And he came to his mom, my sister-in-law, crying, saying he couldn't remember any happy family memories. So that really distressed her. She was really worried about that. And she, you know, we talked about it. He was just feeling so overwhelmed by everything that he was having a hard time going back into his memory and pulling things up. So helping kids do that, and it may be even now one of the things you could do with your kids. And if you were lucky enough to be able to have some positive experiences during all of this, it might be a good idea to do a little, you know, walk down pandemic memory lane. Doesn't mean that you have to be all Sally Sunshine and talk about how great the pandemic was, because I know a lot of people, you know, it's been really hard. But helping your kids look back and say, you know, we did this. Remember when we did this? And even having them do it pre-pandemic is going to be helpful to have them connect to some positive experiences, because they will disconnect from them. That's how anxious and depressed brains work. Anxious brains also actually have a really hard time moving forward and imagining things in a positive way. So if you ask somebody who's really anxious to create a mental picture of a situation, they have a hard time thinking about that in a positive way. They have a hard time coming up with a positive outcome. Oh, look what I did. I forgot that I did this. So here's what I was talking about. Here's the nicbm.com. And this is the neuroplasticity infographic that is just so great. It's small there, so you can't see it. But if you look on it on their website and you can print it out, again, you can print it out in black and white too. But really good stuff. It's got a lot of cool sciencey stuff on the top that kids like to learn about. It talks about the bright side of neuroplasticity and also the dark side, that we can create negative habits and negative pathways as well. So I'm going to talk for a little bit more, and then I'm going to start taking questions. So if you've got a question and you're thinking about it, just go ahead and pop it into the chat if you haven't already. But certainly as I'm talking, you can add questions too. Okay, so this last one, internal versus external. What I'm talking about with this is that anxiety and depression are both referred to as internalizing disorders. So what that means is that although we know a lot of things out in the environment and in the world can precipitate anxiety and depression, that they are often a reaction to environmental things. The way this thing really gets hold of you is in what you do on the inside. So all of these patterns that I'm talking to you about, and when we talk about resilience, or we talk about optimism versus pessimism, there's catastrophic patterns, there's a whole bunch of them. And it really is sort of you going inside and doing this in here. People who are socially anxious, for example, a lot of times they feel like, well, the problem is with other people, right? I'm socially anxious about other people. If other people weren't around, I wouldn't have a problem. Social anxiety is not an external problem. It's an internal problem. It's the conclusions that you come to in your head by yourself about other people. And so what we really want to pay attention to with kids as we're helping them, and again, preventatively, is to make sure that they understand that just because you think it doesn't make it so. And there's an expression we talk about in depression. We say, you are not the best person to talk to you about you, because it's a closed loop. It's just you're just in there doing your thing with no external input. So in terms of depression and anxiety, we really want to pay attention to that internal focus. This is where parents, rightfully so, were concerned that kids were spending so much time alone, that they were sort of alone with their thoughts, alone with their perceptions, alone with their feelings. Again, this is not new to the pandemic. This was a problem before the pandemic. The opposite of internal is, of course, external. And what I mean by that is not to dismiss your internal feelings, because remember I said at the beginning, emotional literacy, being able to recognize what's going on inside of you, being able to understand what your patterns are. It's just the extreme of being internally focused. We want to make sure, and this has been hard during the pandemic, this has absolutely been hard, but think about it as you go forward, is that we want to make sure that kids are externally connected to things outside of themselves, particularly that feel meaningful to them in a positive way. So one of the things that we know from lots of research is that kids that are raised in environments in which they are involved in things like a church or a synagogue, where they are volunteering, maybe they're a part of Scouts, they're doing the robotics club, they're, maybe they're learning how to help an elderly relative, maybe they're even having chores around the house that they do that are meaningful. Kids that are taught how to lift their eyes up and look at things beyond their own perspective do better emotionally. They do better in relationships. So positive connection and being able to make sure that you're fostering that. If you've got a kid that is very introverted, so that, they're not naturally going to be one that wants to join a club or go out, that's okay. The positive connection, we're talking quality, not quantity. They don't have to have a ton of friends. They don't have to do something, they don't have to be the star of the show. But there are plenty of things that you can do as a family that help somebody get out of their own perspective. And we know that that is really a very preventative thing to do. Also, remember that negative connection, right? Positive connection is really contagious. Negative connection is very common and it's very contagious, as we have witnessed in all sorts of ways. In this kinds of situation in which we're all trying to make decisions, in which schools are trying to figure out what to do, parents are trying to figure out what to do, it is very tempting, and this is a human being thing. This is a human being thing. It's very tempting to get pulled into negative connection, which includes things like triangling, gossiping. Triangling, if you're not familiar with that term, that just means that instead of if you have a problem with somebody, instead of talking to that problem to that person directly, you tell somebody else about it, sort of talking behind somebody's back, and then they get word of it. You know how that happens. It happens in families all the time. Happens in my family all the time. My sister, I have a sister who's 2 years older than me. Her son was going through a rough time. This is very recently. And so she asked me if I could call him and have a conversation with him, which surprisingly I get asked to do a lot. So I called him, and he's a great kid. He's 25. So I'm talking to him about this struggle that he's having. He's sort of stuck in this thing that he needs to do. While I was talking to my nephew, my sister was texting me because she was listening to the conversation. Luckily, I didn't have my phone in front of me because I thought my nephew and I thought we were having a private conversation. My sister was eavesdropping and adding commentary to the conversation. That's called triangling. Happens all the time. Hard to completely avoid, but just to be aware of it. Blaming also is a huge negative connector. So it's easy to blame other people. When I'm talking about all the skills, one of the skills I didn't include tonight, I could have included them all, is learning how to own your own stuff, right? Own your stuff. How do you take responsibility for your patterns? How do you take responsibility for what you've done? How do we teach kids to do that? So here are some, hold on, I got a cough. Here are some skill building exercises. I've been talking all day that really are helpful in terms of building positive connection. So this was an assignment actually that at the beginning of the school year, I was going into a lot of schools and they were trying to figure out what they could do and come up with activities for the kids that were going to be in hybrid or remote learning. And this is one of the things that I told so many people to do. Come up with a day, Wednesday, Sunday, Saturday, or if it's in school, make it Monday. And this is brighten somebody else's day. And have everybody do 3 small things that brighten somebody else's day. 3 small things. It doesn't have to even be somebody maybe you just smile and wave at somebody. Maybe you give somebody a compliment on their nice shoes. Maybe you hold the door for somebody. Maybe you help somebody carry their heavy grocery bags to the car. But getting kids out of their own head and teaching them to pay attention to what makes other people feel better is an enormously helpful and preventative skill. This is another thing in terms of another activity, activities that are important to you, but separate from how you feel. And this is just getting kids to recognize that their feelings are not their guiding compass. Again, we want to have emotional literacy, but there are many, many things that we do that we don't feel like. The issue of motivation right now is pretty big. People are telling me, I don't feel motivated. I was just talking to a college kid. I've been talking to a lot of college kids, but they're all sort of starting their second semester right now. A lot of them are remote, still at home. A lot of them are going to have remote classes and hybrid, and kids are saying to me, and this kid was saying to me, I just don't feel motivated to do my work, right? Helping kids understand that there are many things that we do regardless of how we feel is important for them to hear. You don't clean out your rabbit cage when you feel like it. You do it because you want the rabbit to have a clean cage. My husband doesn't clean the litter box for the cat because he feels like it. I don't think he's ever felt like it, but it's for the obvious reasons that you clean out a litter box. We don't, so when you talk to kids and you talk to them about how we can separate activities out from what needs to be done from the way we feel, that's a really important skill to have. Behavioral activation, I'm just going to tell you about it. Behavioral activation is a way that we treat depression. So cognitive behavioral therapy, CBT, is highly effective. When they looked at it, they studied it to figure out what really made it so successful. They found that the behavior was critical to it. And so it's really about saying we need to do things. So if you have a kid right now who you feel like is just sort of detached or just, not really getting it done, not really motivated, the first thing you want to do is you want to throw a ton of empathy at that. It has been hard to sustain this. And then you want to talk about very concretely with them that motivation, it's wonderful if we have it, but it's not all that it's cracked up to be. So let's come up with a way that we can help you get done what you need to get done, even though you fully recognize, mom or dad, you fully recognize that they don't feel like doing it, and you totally understand why. Of course they don't feel like doing it. This has been hard. So let's figure out a way. Maybe you got to make it a game. You know, there's a lot of research that says that rewarding kids is not a way to develop intrinsic motivation. And that is totally true. But right now, you know, we gotta work with what we got. And so making it a game, playing a game with some rewards, little rewards, you know, it's not like if they get an A, you're going to buy them a pony, but, you know, even just playing a Skittles game or anything that allows them to sort of feel like they can get some momentum going in the right direction. The old template that we've been using, it's not going to fit right now. We've got to be creative. We've got to be connected. We've got to be patient. We have to be hugely empathic. There are two words that I couldn't do my job without. The two words, of course, right? I could not do my job if I didn't have those two words. Of course you feel this way. Of course you feel this way. I was talking to a kid the other day who said he just feels so isolated. He says he feels so isolated. And I said, of course you do, right? It'd be weird if you didn't feel that way. So we've got it. And for those of you who are thinking about, you know, kids in college and testing and all that kind of stuff, I will tell you, there are so many kids, and you probably know some of them, maybe you have one of them, where the linear impression, the linear approach that we have in our head, that kids will go to high school and then they'll go to college, right? That has really been turned on its ear. If there is ever a time to recognize that it's not going to be like this, it's now. I am a big fan of saying it doesn't have to be like this ever, but it's not going to be like that. This old template that we expect to happen is just not what we're working with now. And I do think that there are some hidden gifts in there if we pay attention. Because as I said at the beginning, I'll say it again, we weren't doing well before the pandemic. The kids weren't doing well before the pandemic based on the statistics. And the numbers were going in the wrong direction, and they're continuing to go in the wrong direction. I am optimistic, right? I mean, I feel like this is a fixable thing. This is why I talk about it. I am not at the why bother place, although some days I feel like that. I'm not at the why bother place. So we really just have to, you have to be flexible with this. We can't take 2020 and smush it into this old template and think that it's going to look the same. The other thing too, and then I'll start taking some questions. Because you've all been together and because there's been a lot of, you know, we haven't had a lot of space in our worlds right now, don't get sucked into being too controlling and micromanaging your kids. This is not a new thing for me to say. Don't track your kids on their phones. I have very strong feelings about particularly as kids get into junior, senior year in high school, except for some situations. I have very strong feelings about parents that are looking at the parent portal every day, giving kids feedback about the homework assignments that are in and not in, and particularly during this time, right? It is just not helpful. If you have little kids, look for opportunities to increase their autonomy. By autonomy, I mean their independence. We know that kids raised by anxious parents score lower on the autonomy scales. They do not have a sense of their own independence, their own mastery. So pay attention for opportunities to teach that. Let them do things on their own. Let them screw it up. Let them figure out how to fix it. It's all about problem solving. But particularly now, since we've all been sort of, you know, stuck together, don't get pulled into that real tight micromanagement that happens with parenting. I'm never a fan of it, but I know that during all of this, it's easy to sort of slip into that. Yeah. You know, just so you know, I mean, I'm living this myself. I've got a 20-year-old who is a junior in college. He's been home since after Thanksgiving. He'll go back to school on February 1st. And I have a son who graduated from college, sort of. We never got, I paid a ton of money and never got a college graduation ceremony. Still waiting for that. But he's been here, and he's sort of stuck. He was supposed to move to Boston. He was supposed to be out of his parents' house, and he's not. Right? So I am living this. I get it. Life interrupted, right? That's what we're all dealing with. So think about these things. Think about the goals that you've had. Think about what you've learned. Think about the things that you've experienced. If there are 4 words that I would like you to sort of have in your eyeballs and in your brain as we move through this and as we get through the next several months of this, these are the 4 words that are really the most important. I think we got to make sure that our kids are moving. This is, if you listen to me on MUR, I kept saying, go out and take walks, go out and take walks. That's what my mother got annoyed with me for. But you know what? She goes out and takes walks, so she listens. How do we make sure that our kids are engaged? If your kid has completely disconnected, if they have shut down, you need to intervene in that. And you need to talk to them very openly about the fact that you understand why they have disconnected. You totally get it. And you say to them, let's work together to figure out a way to get some of your mojo back, because it's really important. And then volunteerism. And then, that connection, making sure that they have that connection. And remember that joy is contagious too. That human beings have an enormous capacity, even during periods of great struggle and great suffering, to find joy. Blast music in your house, have a dance party, be silly, be unexpected, do things that will offer your kids delight. Show your kids that you're still capable of being playful and silly. So instead of, one night, say we're going to have ice cream sundaes for dinner, or do things if you've got little kids. I know it's hard to be creative after all this time, but do things that show them that joy is possible. Joy is contagious too, and they really need to see us. Modeling has never been more important. It's always critical, but they are looking at us. They're looking at our faces. They're listening to our words. They're modeling our emotional reactions, right? I know that this has been hard work, but it's worth it, isn't it, that we can offer these kids the things that they need. So there's my stuff. You know where to find me. If you haven't listened to Flusterclux, you should, because there's a ton of information on that. Robin and I have been pumping out episodes once a week since, I think, the beginning of April, and we cover all sorts of topics. And if you have any requests or ideas for topics, you can go to flusterclux.com and just send them to us, because we're always looking for ideas and things to talk about. So I am going to stop sharing right now, and we're going to stop recording. We're going to remember to stop recording, right? I saw the little red thing, so we'll hit that, and then we can